Hello. So today I'm going to be doing the Overexplained for the Dragon Pack and potentially the Goblin Pack. In this video, it's just going to be one of these two though, so we'll see which one we get and aim towards first. The easier one to kind of force on a run is the Dragon idea, and yeah, we'll go with that. And the reason this has taken so long to come out is because I've been working with Silver on, working with Silver, I should say, on getting something out to make presenting these a little bit easier outside of just doing video formatted style stuff. And what I mean by that is, if you haven't seen in the Discord right now, Silver has published a community hub website where you can find things like a forum to converse with other people that play Oak and Tower, share builds, share like your towers and screenshots and all this stuff, as well as making tier lists, as well as making guide formats. So if I show you this right now, everything I'm going to be saying in this video, I have gone through, I have written up, and basically made into written versions of the guide too, covering the playstyles that I'm going to mention. Both versions will be in there, so you can reference that, and I'll leave a link to those in the description, as well as pinned in the comments to go and look at those in case you want a written version instead of a video version. That being said, let's get into the run. We're not going to be running merge. We are going to be running turtle. So this is the setup that I kind of mentioned. It's a kind of aggressive setup. It's very stable. You get stuff like electric. So if you get this early, you pretty much just win boards from the extra 20 damage a second that this applies. You got stuff like Darkness in here, which gives you the re-triggering style combat effects, which is for either your Marrow or your Talon, so that way you can ramp up your crit and your damage faster. And then you got Turtle, which is just a strong perk. It's a lot of EHP throughout the run to be able to like stave off damage and just win from EHP diffing. And then you've got Tempo, which is just a solid perk overall. We're going to be running with these pack setups. This is kind of what I've been running when I've been running Dragon and Goblin stuff, just because it doesn't really... You don't have this stuff like blowing the pool. You don't need Frosty on anymore for Sapphire Amulet since it's in the Dragon pack. And all that being said, I think we can just go now. So these two packs are very strong, very good in the current shape of the game. We've got Turtle, so it's in a pretty good spot. So to start with Dragon, what you're mainly looking for is Draconic Spears and a Marrow or a Dragon Bone, and you're kind of going to just take whichever one shows up first. So we got the Spears, so we're going to put that in front. And it's important not to combine your Spears early. So when it comes to Draconic Spear, what this does is, on crit, it permanently transfers whatever crit is on this item, where it says it's 15%, for example, to the next item on the right. Right now, there's nothing in the right slot because obviously it can't target anything, so it won't get anything. But if this was where the goblet was and the goblet was where this was, when this crits, it would give that crit to the goblet instead, and then this would have nothing on it. For that reason, you don't want to transfer the crit in its base form, really. You want to make sure to star it up first a little bit, because you get more value for doing so. What ends up happening is, when it's at 1 star, it sends 2 times the crit, so instead of being 30%, the item would receive the 60%. And then at 2 star, it would have sent 3 times the crit. So instead of 60% here, it would send 180% crit. So for that reason, we kind of do this. And we're going to roll a little bit. We see a Marrow. We're going to sell out of the Goblin and pick this up. Now, unfortunately, Marrow's not that great in its base form. It really needs some buffing from this, for example. I also see a Spyglass, which I'm going to freeze for. And yeah, so something we're going to aim for, basically, is something looking like this. Now, we're going to buff these with crit, so this is going to constantly get crit throughout the run, and then that's going to transfer the crit into the Marrow, and what Marrow does is, at the start of combat, gain +1 bonus multicast per 50% crit. So early game, not that great, you're just getting a bunch of bonus multicast at the start of a combat, but as you start starring up, it gets more multicast, and then at 2 star, it gains damage and multicast. And then at 3 star, it gets those stats permanently. So it becomes quite the monster with enough crit to get it going. So now that we've got a Spyglass, we're going to do this, and yep, we're going to target all 3 items like this now. We are going to keep it a little bit low, just so we can actually find the common items that we want. This is a roll down strategy. So you will keep your health a little bit low at the start, and then you'll just take that momentum of all the stuff that you just got from like all this power that we're gaining to just spam level and catch back up. I'm gonna keep going. On we did get a spyglass. If you don't find a Talon early, it is perfectly reasonable to have a spyglass in its place, doing something like this, targeting the free items, getting yourself your crit rate up, and going like that. We don't have a weapon that works with lemon and limes here, otherwise this would be a lot of gold to gain off the bat. But we can just take the goblet instead and hold on to it. So we got marrow, take this. Usually I recommend leveling to 3 before combining stuff, but in a build like this, you really want to get your 2 sour on your marrow, and you really want to get your 2 sour on your draconic spear. So it is completely okay to keep under level 3, look for those items, and combine before getting your epic chest. So there we go, we got our spear. It's at this point we could technically now start feeding the crit from the spear into the marrow, because it is more value, but depending on what we find, we could potentially hold out for a little bit. So this has 70% crit now, so I want to move this down here and put this up here. This now having extra multicast means that we get more value from the shield slot. So we're going to freeze for the spear, and we're going to keep going. A lot of the Dragon Pack does boil down to just how much crit you can give an item. So, for example, he's already started feeding, so his marrow is much larger than us. But you could do the same thing with Dragon Bone. If we do this, the spears cannot feed into themselves, so you can like have the spears down here like this to avoid them feeding their crit into something. And we can hunt now for our last few spears. Once we have the spear 2-star, we are then going to level and pair off this. We might drop around 2 early just because the fact that we are getting unlucky with finding what we want to find. You can think of it a lot like a merge strategy, but it's more expensive. It used to be more disgusting. I did the speedrun videos and stuff of it, of course. But in this shape and form, it is still very, very strong. It's just struggling a little bit more early game. We're just going to sell whatever comes from these blue chests whilst we hunt for our spears. There was a Talon. I do want the Talon, but at this point, we really need to get these spears upgraded so we can then start leveling. There we go. So we're going to feed crit into the spear, which will then give 3 times that crit value into the marrow. And then at the next combat, because obviously it's not going to do anything during the combat that it's feeding, and it will then get a lot more multicast and a lot more damage. Finding something like Trident's also pretty nice for the early game, because it just means that we're going to get a little bit more value. So as you can see here, it's got 46 damage and 10 multicast. We're going to feed that crit in. It's now at 560% crit. Going into the next combat, it's going to have a lot of damage and a lot of value. 62 and 34. And this is just going to melt down health bars. Take Life Surge, start making up some of that lost ground. And it's just going to keep growing as the combat goes. Now that we're in this sort of shape, we want to be finding things like Talon, like we saw previously. As that is then going to just give us more crit scaling throughout the run. And it's going to obviously give 10% to this, and then 10% to this, and then this is going to give 3 times that, so this is going to give 30% over to this. When it comes to Celestia, free-starring, if you're going to try to go into Endless and stuff, you want to free-star the Spear. But if you're just going for 10 wins, I always recommend free-starring the Bow, because what this ends up doing is just gaining the stat permanently, which just secures your wins later if you end up going past the day 11. We're just going to level, because we want to catch up in health. That is a painful thing to run into this early. By early, it is day 9, but that is quite painful to see. And things like NyQuil will go really well into this as well. So if we could find something like that, there's a Talon, we could slot this in. So now we're going to be getting 10%, 15% when this triggers, so this is 5%, so 15% total crit. Which is then going to feed onto this, which is then actually going to be around 45% crit. So here it's at 30%. We keep going. We could take Exaltation here, buff everything by 15, or we could take Benediction and try to lucky roll into more things of Talons. So I'm going to take that. We're going to level for now and just look through our lucky rolls. Okay, we did not get either of that. Frozen Jaw and a NyQuil, though, was very nice. Okay, now you can see, now that it's 3-star, it's gaining all those stats permanently based on the 50% crit for each 50% crit it has. So this is just going to get out of hand very fast now. Slot off Rosy Jaw, we can sell out the Trident, and we can put in a Nyquil. There is an argument that we could have just sold the Spyglass instead of the Trident, but I like the idea of, if a round goes long enough, we get a little bit of extra crit onto the Spear. I feel like that's going to do more damage long term than having the Trident. And now we get a bunch of damage onto the Marrow. And we keep going. Another Talon, we can slot that in instead of Spider Glass. Talon. Warhorn's fine. If the round goes long enough, it'll just activate onto the Marrow, giving it a bunch of damage. This is quite scary to see. But Marrow being Marrow. And that's the 10 win. So let's go over the collection, shall we? So in Dragon, you have a lot of good items. Honestly, there's only really 2 items in here that are kind of meh. Every other item is very, very good. So what you just saw in that run was a combination of Marrow and Draconic Spear with Talon. You could do the same thing with Talon, Draconic Spear, and Dragon Bone. It's just the way that damage comes out is a little bit different. And I will talk about that in a second. So Marrow is probably the strongest, well, the second strongest item in Dragon. In its base form, it's not that great. You have to give it a lot of crit for it to be even like remotely close to the DPS of regular bow, for example. But it is generally decent of a start because you can just throw it into one of the slot busts and you just gain value throughout stacking crit on it. At the 1-star, again, as you saw, it gains double the amount of bonus multicast per 50% crit that it gets, and it gets a little bit stronger. Then at 2-star is when it becomes an actual monster, and all that crit that you're now stacking on it, it gains +3 bonus multicast and 2 damage per 50% crit, and it's quite easy to feed a lot of crit into it when you're stacking up a Draconic Spear. When you come to 3-star, it gains all of that permanently, and it becomes absolutely disgusting, as you saw at the end of that run there. Then you have Draconic Spear, which permanently transfers the crit rate that is on the item to the next item on the right, which is how you feed crit into other items, is by having multiple sources of crit stacking onto Draconic Spear, and then feeding that spear into, say, a Marrow or a Dragon Bone. As you get it to 1-star, 2 times the amount of crit gets sent, 2-star, 3 times the crit, and then when you get it to 3-star, it becomes disgusting, as it permanently gives 3 times the amount of crit on the item to the right. So, this might look like the same thing as the 2-star version, but what this is doing is never removing the crit from itself and just buffing the item to the right with how much crit the Draconic Spear has. So if this thing has 1000% crit, every single trigger will give 1000 crit to the item to the right, because it will no longer be removing the crit from itself. This is why in Endless mode, 3-starring the Spear before 3-starring the Marrow is much more preferred, because then that way you can keep ramping the crit up and exponentially keep giving more and more and more crit to the item to the right. Which is how you see things like the big Cobalt Spears in Endless mode, for example. You can, you basically stack up a bunch of crit on the Draconic Spear, you feed that constantly onto another receptacle, which is usually something like Nightfall, because this is also scaling its own crit and damage. And then once you're at a point where you're suitable for the amount of crit and damage it has, you feed it onto a 3-star Cobalt Spear, which then gains 8 times that crit. And yeah, you're gonna give this thing so much crit rate that something like a 3-star Warhorn just goes absolutely bizarre when it triggers. That being said, in a 10 trophy run though, it's a little slow because you're not gonna get a lot of crit onto the Draconic Spear, so I much prefer 3-starring the Marrow in that sort of environment. But if you're ever in a world where you can do both, then you can just 3-star both of these and you're pretty much just guaranteed to win anyway. Going over to Dragon Bone. Dragon Bone deals bonus damage equal to the crit chance on the weapon. So this does crit, but does not scale from crit multiplier, unfortunately. So the 15 damage that you see present on the Dragon Bone can crit, and that will become 30 damage, and that part is affected by crit multiplier. But the bonus damage that happens on trigger does not get affected by the crit multiplier. I've done many runs of testing the Frozen Jaw onto the Dragon Bone. It just never changes how much the number actually comes from the crit damage itself of the on trigger. But you can see the on trigger damage is like usually more than what it says on your crit rate. Just because of the fact that it is calculating the fact that you are doubling the damage from the crit chance itself. But when this thing gets to ludicrously high amounts of crit from feeding a Draconic Spear, this thing can one-tap towers, and it can get to that point pretty quick in a run, and that build guide version is also present on the website, which is here. Yeah, it's kind of it's not as strong as the Marrow variant, but it does get you there pretty comfortably. The only downside is the fact that how slow of like getting this rolling is. Unlike the Marrow, which has multicast and can just trigger it like indefinitely once it does its first trigger. If you don't one shot with the Dragon Bone, you have to wait for the next cooldown cycle and then kill the tower, which usually is enough time for you to like lose a round in that time, which is why it's a little bit weaker. But that being said, as you start it up, it starts dealing double the amount of damage, and then triple the amount of damage, and then at 3-star, it deals 5 times the amount of damage. This thing can get out of hand pretty fast. When you feed it enough crit, this is going to do a lot of damage. But since it doesn't get synergy with the Frozen Jaw, you have to look for other ways of giving it synergy, which usually comes from using items like Nature's Call to give it multicast instead, which I think is a pretty fair trade-off. You're taking away one tower slot to give it a different tower slot, in a sense, so you're giving it Nature's Call. This is why Strike isn't too bad of a perk choice if you plan to go Dragon Bone instead of Marrow. If you plan to go Dragon Bone, I highly suggest using Strike for the multicast slot, because if it gets put on the right side of the tower, then you can give this multicast instantly for free. You pair that with a Talon, feeding in to a Draconic Spear to keep feeding in crit onto the Dragon Bone, and this thing in a couple of days will start 2-shotting to even 1-shotting towers when it gets to 1-star and even 2-star. When it comes to the rest of the pack, you got Talon, which is probably the best item like in the pack, just because everything in here revolves around getting crit, and this is a very stable, easy to find source of crit, and has multiple usages in the run of how to give an item crit. So you just throw it on the board, and then every item on your board is getting plus 10% crit chance at the start of combat, sorry. This is a lot stronger than it sounds, because sure, you're like, okay, that's 10% crit onto a Draconic Spear, that's not that great, but if you have the components split, so you have, say, one at the top, one at the bottom, and then you just have a Talon on the board, that's now technically 20% crit that Draconic Spear is getting, because when the items combine, it will merge whatever crit value is on the two split items together. So you have this in your tower, Draconic Spear at the top, Draconic Spear at the bottom. 2 days, that is now 40% crit. 3 days, that is now 60% crit. And then, obviously, if once you star it up, it's going to give double that. So it's going to do 120% crit. Talon's very, very strong for that reason, because you can just stack up ludicrous amounts of crit in a minimal amount of time. You can throw on Night Quill, which is somewhere here, which will re-trigger it at the start of combat because of the fact that it is a start of combat effect, so you get extra trigger of it. And that's how you ramp up crit steadily throughout the run, because if you're going to be killing things very, very quick with, say, a Dragon Bone or a Marrow, you don't really have time for Spyglass to trigger anymore. So through the mid-game to the late game, you end up selling out of Spyglass, as you saw that I did, where I sold out of it to put down an extra Talon, because of the fact you're just killing too quick that it never gets a trigger. So Talon is basically 10% crit in the time that this you usually would take to give like 5%, which is quite nice. And for 30 gold, I think that's completely reasonable. It used to be cheaper, which made it stronger, but even at 30 gold, it's still very, very strong. Dragon Orb is a tried and true... Oh, I guess I should talk about the star levels. The 1-star gives 20% crit, the 2-star gives 40% crit, and the 3-star gives crit, 100% crit, and damage at the start of combat. So, in doing ladder climbs, you're not really going to be leveling up the Talon all that much. Just the base form is enough. Like 30 gold for 10% crit is a lot. So it's quite nice just to have it as a plain copy. But if you do find more copies and you get to like 1-star or even 2-star in like say day 13 area, you're suddenly going to be getting even more value fed onto your Dragon Bone or fed onto your Marrow, which is never something that's really like sad, because if you're 2-starring this, then this is already 2-starred. So it's actually a lot more value. So 40% crit, you know, times 3, that's 120% crit per round. It's quite a lot of damage to add on to a Marrow or a Dragon Bone. Dragon Orb, this is just the tried and true Dragon Orb that we've had in the game for a long time. It's went through many iterations. It used to be Life Essence, for example. It's just gaining max health, and then this item could crit, which is affected by the critical multiplier, so Frozen Jewel does buff it. It's a very strong item. Get this early into the run so you get some like extra health from the Dragon Orb before you start leveling, and suddenly each level is going to give you more and more health. It's very, very, very nice. You start up and it gives even more health. Start up again and it gives even more health, and then you start up again to 3-star and it starts giving health and gold, and both of those effects can crit, and both of those effects are affected by the critical multiplier. So Dragon Orb is very, very strong. It's much better for something like Endless, but if you do get it in the early days of ladder climbing, it is incredibly strong just to be able to EHP diff your opponents and give you more of a wiggle room to be able to like roll down for what you need, because obviously now you have a much higher base health pool to work with. It's a nice stable utility item. I'm not going to prioritize it in this sort of run over one of these 4 items, for example. But if I was to go into something later, like Endless, etc., I would slot these on just to like get some passive health increase, as well as drag rounds out a little bit longer, so that way you get potentially more triggers of these, but also so you have more health and potentially gold income for like being able to pivot and roll down and stuff like that for Endless mode to build up a stronger board. Then you have Horde. Horde is incredibly, incredibly strong for Endless mode. Is possibly the best source of gold in the game and the best source of income in the game outside of just generating thousands of items with something like Cursed Garment. So what Horde does is, on trigger, it gains +2 gold and +2 sell value. Now remember, sell value is half of the item's base cost. So if I remember rightly, this is 36 gold, so it sells for 18. And now every time this triggers, you're going to be increasing that sell value by 2. So it'll go to 20, 22, 24, 26. But these effects can also crit. So it's also affected by the critical multiplier. So if you get this thing's cooldown reduction, so it's no longer a 5-second cooldown, and give it multicast, this thing can generate a bunch of gold, and then when you're ready to sell it, you can pretty much full pivot your board to whatever you want, and it's very easy to get this thing going and going insane. I think the world record run for income right now is basically slotting 6 of these, well, 5 of these plus a Frozen Jewel with a bunch of multicast. It's kind of ludicrous how much value this thing gives. As you start starring it up, it gives like double the amount of gold, double the amount of sell value. Then you get to 2-star and it starts giving gold and double the sell value again. So, and it has a guaranteed crit at this point, so you don't even need to feed it too much crit to get it going. Plus, obviously, you're going to have the critical effect of Frozen Jewel, increasing it, so it goes crazy. But then when you get it to 3-star, it also gives you gold, sell value, and income, which both, well, all 3 of these could still crit. So the +2 income could even crit from, say, your Frozen Jewel. So this thing is just going to give you so much gold throughout the run that it pretty much means if you have one of these on your board, you get this cooldown reduced, you give it multicast, and you survive and get into Endless, this thing is going to allow you to pivot to whatever build you want to make a stable Endless build. You can easily go from, saying, entering Endless with a stacked up Horde, selling it, and then, like, making your perfect Cobalt Spear, like, generating build, making your perfect, Cursed Shield build, or making your perfect 1,000 Cuts build, etc. The only thing it doesn't really help with is getting like persistent effects onto the board faster, because obviously if you wanted to pivot into the potion belt spam stuff, it's kind of hard to go from doing Horde straight into doing Pandora's Box, because at that point you need to have rounds drag out long enough that this gets to trigger. So it's a little bit hard doing that, but it does make so much money to the point where you could do whatever you want in the game with that money. And in a 10-win run, you're not really going to pick it up as like a source of infinite income, but it's more of like, if I get this from a chest or it's just sat in the shop early enough in the run, I can pick this up, just put it on my board, and eventually this thing is going to generate more gold than I spent on it, or it's just going to generate a bunch of passive income for me whilst it's just sat there, and then if I need to like have an emergency situation, I can sell it and just roll down and fix my board, or I can sell it and level up a bunch and catch back up into the tempo of the game and just win from that. Like, it is a very good item in that sense for just being something that you can just AFK on your board in a spare slot. Frozen Jaw, not too much to talk about when it comes to this. It just increases the critical effect multiplier. This means things like Turtle, for example, gains where it gives you 2 times shield on crits. This affects that. It affects Chosen with the 2 times healing on crits. This affects any of these effects that say these can crit, including the Dragon's Call, and including critical damage. As you star it up, it just gains even more critical multiplier, and it keeps going up, up, and up. It's a very strong item. It's just a little boring, like, obviously because it's just a single effect, but it does make big number bigger, which a lot of people's brains will go burr when it comes to big number going bigger. Dragon's Call. This is the Dragon's Call we know and love from like the bow slop days, but it's a little bit changed. On trigger, if you only have unique bows, trigger your other bows 1 time. These effects can crit, which by it saying this effect can crit does mean it's affected by the critical strike effect multiplier. So you can get this thing to trigger a lot. It does involve a little bit more work into getting it going, but the base form, it's 30% crit. You have a 30% chance to make your bows go bizarre. It's fine. Still has the free charges. It's a 5.2 second cooldown with 70 damage. It's never really the damage that you're looking at when it comes to the Dragon's Call. It's always that on trigger effect, and it still has the feedback loop of triggering your launcher, which then your launcher can trigger the Dragon's Call, and then that just triggers your entire board. As you start starring it up, of course, it's going to gain more and more crit because the crit chance will double from the base effect, and then the on trigger effect becomes 2 times, which again, still able to crit. And then the 2-star becomes 3 times and no longer requires your bows to be unique. So if you notice, on the 1-star and the 0-star versions, it says if you only have unique bows, this means you cannot have, say, 2 launches or 2 venom strikes, etc. You can only have single copies of those bows on the board. You can obviously style them up, and that's fine. You just can't have 2 bows of the exact same name on the board at once, otherwise this effect will be disabled. But when you get it to 2-star, that disappears, and you can have multiple copies of the same bow on the board and still gain its effect, and it's still crit. So this thing is going to be going a lot more than 3 times. It's actually going to be going 6 times that base when you get it over 100% crit. And then obviously critical strike multiply will make it go like 2, 3, 6, 9, etc., etc. It's not really much to say about it because it's just, it depends on the bows that you're pairing it with. The 3-star version obviously does a little bit more by giving all those bows permanent damage on their trigger as well. But if you pair this, say, with Marrow, it's a little bit redundant, obviously, because Marrow is already going to go burr with just Draconic Spear, so having it trigger more doesn't really do much. You would need the 3-star version for it to be any use to the Marrow. It does have a lot of base damage at 3-star as well. But when you pair it with things like Venom Strike and Launcher, or you pair it with, say, Molten Bow and stuff, it still goes kind of crazy. It's just not something that synergizes too well with its own pack, but the fact that the item effect can crit and it can be affected by Frozen Jaw does fit quite nicely. Kingslayer. Unfortunately, this at the start of this, I did say there's like 2 items in here that are kind of meh in the pack, which these are the 2 items, which is Dragon's Call and Kingslayer. Kingslayer is a little boring in the sense that on trigger, it just gains +1 damage per dragon item that you have on the board, and this effect of crit. So again, Frozen Jaw is a dragon item, so this will be included in that, counting that. Increasing your critical multiplier will just increase how much damage it's gaining per trigger. The 1-star version is okay, it's a bit slow, but doesn't have any crit. You have to feed it crit from the Draconic Spear, so you need to get this thing, or from Talon, etc. You need to get this thing to 100% crit before it starts actually becoming useful. It can just ramp up damage and one-shot towers. It's quite consistent at doing that, and it's quite comfortable, and it's not a bad weapon by any means. But there's just much easier methods of doing that within the Dragon Pack, which aren't legendary, doesn't cost as much, and give you more results for doing the same thing. When you get it to 1-star, it's 2 damage per dragon item, and then 2-star, it gains 3 damage per dragon item, and then at 3-star, it gains 4 damage per dragon item, and it also gains it as a start combat effect. So you could do, obviously, like the Dark Orb, Dark Necklace, looping of triggering the start combat effect over and over and over and over again to get this thing ramping. The only downside is in ladder play, this thing is never going to get crazy. Like a Dragabone is going to outpace it. This thing is never going to get crazy because of the fact you end up killing with it too quickly for it to ramp up its on trigger effect. So eventually you'll like one-shot towers, and then you'll be two-shotting towers, and then you'll be three-shotting towers. Which obviously isn't a bad thing, but it just means it can be easily outpaced. But if you get this cooldown reduce, you give it multicast, this thing can still go crazy. It's just, whatever you're doing to this, you could literally use it on a Marrow, or you could do the same thing to a Dragonbone, and you'll get the same results, if not better results, as the run develops. It's still a fun item, though. I'll probably upload some runs with it down the line. It's still pretty good and interesting. In terms of build pathing and the way that I would play Dragon, as you saw in the run, Barrow, very good. Again, it's just basically finding as many Draconic Spears early as possible as you can to get to 2-star. You could do this via either manually buying them like I did in this run, or by finding a Conjure Spear on day 3 and generating those spears. Finding something like a Talon or a Spyglass early enough to feed crit into the spear, and then funneling that crit once you star it up. Not before starring it up, but once it's already upgraded a little bit. You can do it earlier than 2-star. I prefer to do it at 2-star because then you're getting a lot of value. But if you really want to, you can start doing it at 1-star. It is perfectly fine, as long as you have a way of constantly giving crit to it to make up for that. Then yeah, it's very strong. But you basically funnel that into a Marrow or a Dragonbone, and that's pretty much your build. It's very simple to get going, very consistent, very, very strong, and can easily be like spam to get easy wins on the ladder. And for a more written version of that, again, it is over on the oaken.gg website. And Dragonbone, as well as many other builds and stuff, which both Silver and I are working on fleshing out this thing. If you see something like Bomb Wagon, for example, on here in B tier, it's not because Bomb Wagon's bad, it's just because in comparison to these other things, they're just stronger and faster to get going. Nothing in here is really ever going to be bad, apart from if they're like down here. Then that just means that like they're slow. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.